I'm not sure what I'm doing here. One of the most viewed videos I have on this channel was my reaction to Ben Shapiro and his presidential tier list. As a fellow conservative, and please understand when I say that, I'm not saying Republican. I hate both major political parties in this country. I think they both suck. I don't really identify with either one of them, but I am kind of a center-right conservative. So he is kind of on the same side of the political spectrum as me, though he's much more extreme than I am. I found a lot of disagreements with his presidential tier list. And then apparently this video came out 2 days ago, because anytime a video comes out that a lot of people want me to do a reaction to, I immediately within minutes start getting multiple comments from people saying, hey, you've got to check this video out. And probably more than any recent video that I've had, people have been asking me to take a look at Ben Shapiro's America's Worst Presidents video. It's only about 11 minutes long, so we're going to take a look at it. A couple of caveats as we get into this. Number one, I have no doubt he's going to be touching on modern politics, which is something I generally try to avoid on this channel. Because this is a channel about history, and I know that we all have very strong opinions when it comes to modern politics, and it can be very difficult for us to set that aside. So I try to keep my history focused on kind of pre-1990, because it seems like even once we get into the 80s, people start to have really strong opinions, especially when it comes to political leaders. So I'm going to be very kind of cautious about how I approach this. Number two, I fully recognize that as a extreme right-wing conservative, Ben Shapiro is going to be coming at this from his bias. We all have bias. Even those of us who say we're trying not to be biased are still biased. And what do I mean by bias? Well, every one of us is, the way we view the world is very heavily influenced by a lot of factors. Our racial background, our gender, our financial situation, what part of the world we live in, what our parents were like, what part of the country we live in, our job, all of those things, the trauma that we've experienced in our life. I could go on and on and on, but every one of us is impacted by all of those factors, and then they change how we see the world. Two of us could see the exact same set of circumstances and have a completely different reaction to those things. Perfect example of this, I was having a kind of a back and forth conversation with the guys from the operations room on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. And he was complaining about a particular portrayal in a scene on Masters of the Air. I went back and watched the same scene 4 or 5 times in a row to try and see what he was seeing, and I just didn't see it that way, no matter how many times I looked at it. Why is that? Both of us were looking at the same thing. Both of us know history. Both of us care about history. But we have very different backgrounds, and all of those biases come into play, and we can see the exact same scene but take something very different away from it. Doesn't mean one of us is right or wrong. It just means we see it differently. So I fully expect his bias to be a part of that. That was a really, really long introduction, 4 minutes for this video. So let's go ahead and dive into this, and I'm going to try my best to set as much of my bias aside as I can, recognizing full well that none of us can do that. Link is in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary.
Who are the 5 worst presidents in America?
I'm going to just real quick make a prediction that all 5 of them are going to be Democrats. I don't know who the 5 are. Who do I think Ben Shapiro is going to make in his bottom 5? Well, Joe Biden and Barack Obama probably, which is stupid. You can't, I say this all the time, you cannot rank presidents within 10 years or even ones that are still in office. There's no way that with any degree of objectivity we can rank people like Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama yet. We just can't do it. But I think those two will probably be there. Probably put Jimmy Carter in there. Woodrow Wilson, I hope. I guess we'll see.
American history. Now, you've heard a lot of historians sound off on this, and they'll give you names like Donald Trump, George W. Bush. That's because they're partisan hats. We're going to talk about the 5 real worst presidents in American history.
Not a fact, though. It's opinion.
Worst president, Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter?
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
So Jimmy Carter actually kind of pales in comparison to the other 4 because he only had 1 term to ruin America. But everybody remembers stagflation, really, really high levels of inflation and stagnation, huge unemployment rates, 8, 9, 10%, inflation rates, 14%, massive gasoline shortages, gas lines, the Iranian Revolution, which he sort of backed. I mean, he let.
So one thing I do want to say here, and I do agree that Jimmy Carter was not a good president. Let's recognize up front that in every case, every president is to some degree inheriting stuff from not only the previous administration, but that has been building up for years. So Iran, for example. Do I put that at the feet of Jimmy Carter? Not really. Because the stuff that led to that crisis in those events that were unfolding, like the hostage situation that he was dealing with, the groundwork for that was laid for decades before that. It's the same thing with that series of presidents leading up to Abraham Lincoln. Do I think they were bad? James Buchanan, for example, terrible president. But that said, if Buchanan had been president, say, 30 years later, would he be viewed as badly? I don't think he would. I think he came to the office at a time when a lot was going wrong, and he just wasn't the extremely high-end leader that was needed in that moment to keep it from getting worse. So it's a combination of not being great as a leader, but also coming to power at a time when a lot was going wrong. So I don't blame Jimmy Carter for all of this, but I do think he was kind of in over his head.
Let the Shah fall, leading to the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 to 1980. He entered the presidency, pledging to reverse our, quote, inordinate fear of communism, and the Soviet Union took him up on that, then invading Afghanistan. That's all the stuff he did while he was president, but he wasn't president for that long. He was president for 4 years and 4 years only.
Yeah, but a lot of people were president for only 4 years, and we still put them, kind of in the bottom or the top, depending on how they did. A lot of people rate James Polk as a great president, and he was only in office for 4 years. But again, I would say, yeah, I think he was in over his head. I think he definitely made some mistakes in terms of how he viewed the world. The stuff on communism, yeah, certainly was not helpful. He didn't do any favors for the economy. But again, I think he inherited a lot of that too.
He was a horrible post-president. He built
horrible
some houses
post-president. Now, that's interesting. One thing I've always said about Jimmy Carter is in terms of his character, I think he's a great man. Some great men are not great in a particular role. Let's talk, just in terms of generals. There are some people who are great men who are not great generals. There are some people who are great men but not great presidents. Jimmy Carter was not a great president, but I think he's a great man. I'd be curious to see what he has to say about what makes Jimmy Carter's post-presidency not good.
Those people.
Look, it's Jimmy Carter.
That's great. He also hung out with Hamas.
Yeah, it is great, but let's not just dismiss it. That's part of the bias coming in, right? When we kind of just throw out negative things that someone we like did, or throw out positive things that someone we are predisposed not to like did.
And actively wrote speeches for Uber terrorist Yasser Arafat.
Yeah, that wasn't great.
Claiming that Hamas's election was actually legitimate. He opposed U.S. intervention in the Gulf War in Kuwait. He actively wrote.
I don't necessarily have a problem with that. If someone is being consistent to their values, and that means that they oppose something that is very popular, all right. Perfect example. The very first woman to be ever elected to Congress, she voted against U.S. involvement in both World War I and World War II. She actually voted against the declaration of war on Japan, and then they talked her into, Rankin was her name, Jeanette Rankin, talked her into kind of not voting on the declaration of war against Germany. But if that was consistent with her character and consistent with her values, which is that war is wrong in any circumstance, I don't agree with her on that, but I don't have a problem with her being consistent in that way. So I wouldn't hold it against Jimmy Carter that he opposed the Gulf War. I disagree with him on that, but it's okay.
Letter to other members of the UN Security Council asking them to vote against the United States. That's wild. He helped broker the North Korean nuclear deal that eventually led to North Korea gaining nuclear weapons. So, yeah.
That's a hindsight thing where we can judge him and say, you know what, in hindsight probably wasn't the best. But again, I think he probably had good intentions there. So, is Jimmy Carter in my bottom 5 presidents of all time? And I don't know if he's got 5. I'm just guessing. I thought somebody said there were 5. But would he be in my bottom, like 4 or 5? I don't think he would. I think he'd probably be maybe bottom 10.
Terrible, terrible ex-president. Probably a worse ex-president than he was even as president, which is saying a lot. He's a real crap president.
I don't agree with that.
Barack Obama clocks in on this list at number 4.
Not even, I'd put him in the middle somewhere right now. But again, I don't think it's fair to judge someone less than 20 years after they've left office. We just can't possibly know all of that stuff.
Thank God for Obama, because at least now, they know Kenya.
But no, he wasn't a
Please
terrible
don't bring up
president.
Obama.
To understand what a bad president Barack Obama is, you have to understand Trump is an outgrowth of Barack Obama. He's a reaction to Obama. And then Biden is a reaction to Trump.
That I 100% agree with. I do believe that the reaction to Obama led to Trump. I don't necessarily agree with the reaction to Obama, but I think we're at a time in history when we've gotten so polarized. And granted, I'm 46 years old, so I don't remember what things were like before. And if I look back in history, I can see plenty of times when we were equally or worse polarized. This isn't the first time we've been this polarized. It's just happening again. But the days of Ronald Reagan as president working hand in hand with a Democratic Speaker of the House and Tip O'Neill to make things happen, those days are pretty much gone. Pretty much now the attitude is if the person is from the other party, everything they do is bad. And that's just not the reality at all. But I do agree that that the attitude people had about Barack Obama did lead directly to Trump, and I do believe that the attitude people had about Trump did lead directly to Biden. And I honestly, and I don't talk about my opinions on modern things very often, but I told some people this when I was in the UK. As far as I can see, our options suck this year. We have 330 million people in this country, and those are the best 2 we can come up with.
So if you're going to talk about where American politics truly went completely off the rails, the answer is Barack Obama. Barack Obama came into office as a unifier.
I'm so excited because we are going to change the world.
And then he proceeded to radically divide the American population. You can see it in...
I do agree that for the people who supported Barack Obama and voted for him, and that includes my state of Ohio, at least the first time. I can't remember. I think, did he lose the second time? Gosh, I can't remember now. No, he did win Ohio both times. Ohio typically has gone for the winner in the elections. 2020 was an exception to that. But there was a lot of optimism when Barack Obama was elected. Remember that a lot of times when people are elected to 2 terms as president, there's a lot of unpopularity that sinks in their second term in office. And I think that was true for George W. Bush after he got reelected in 2004. So I think people were ready for a change, and I think there was a lot of optimism, and he did come in with a lot of support as people viewed him in that way. I don't think he was intentionally divisive, but I think it did happen.
Polling data. 72% of white adults thought race relations were good in 2013. So did 66% of black people. By 2015, that number was 51% of blacks and 45% of whites. Barack Obama's racial polarization was dramatic. He presided over race riots in Ferguson and Baltimore. He promoted the lie that...
Let's be careful, though, about what we blame on presidents. Because a lot of time, the things that we pin on presidents aren't necessarily there. Like, to say he presided over race riots, I think is a little unfair. That would be like saying Bill Clinton presided over the Columbine shootings. It wasn't Bill Clinton's fault that those two young men did what they did. It happened during his administration. Now, you can fault someone for how they respond to it, for how they use the bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt described it, to make that situation worse or to make it better. And honestly, I don't really remember how Barack Obama dealt with that, but I don't think you can blame the fact that it happened on him.
Police officers all over the United States are racist, contributing to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, raising crime rates around the country.
These young men are incredibly angry.
He presided over the weakest economic recovery in modern American history because his decision was he was going to spend endless amounts of money and regulate the living hell out of the economy.
Well, let's remember some of that spending did happen toward the end of the Bush administration, too. So it wasn't just Obama that was doing all that spending. It happened before he even took office. He just
The Congressional
continued
Budget Office initially said that Obamacare would cost $940 billion. It has now been estimated it will cost $1.7 trillion. Life expectancy in the United States in 2010, when Obamacare kicked in, was 78.54. Today, it is 77.28. So,
Okay, but let's keep in mind that COVID happened during that time, so I don't know how much that is to be blamed on Obamacare.
nailed it with Obamacare. He polarized the country on social issues, including, most prominently, same-sex marriage, where he simply decided to reverse his position from 2008 on same-sex marriage and declare that everybody who actually held his position from 2008 was an evil, bigot, terrible person.
I don't think he said it that way. And can we acknowledge here for a minute that Donald Trump was also in favor of gay marriage from the time he's actually the first person to run on that. And if you go back and listen, for all of Donald Trump's many, many faults, and he has many, especially when it comes to his personal character, I'm not questioning that at all. But if you look at his acceptance speech in 2016 for the Republican nomination, and I was watching it because I was on Frank Luntz's focus group at the Republican convention in Cleveland. So if you go back and watch the focus group after the convention every night, I was a part of that. And so that was kind of my 15 minutes of fame on national TV. I thought it was a great speech, and he was actually very much pro-gay rights in that speech. Now, you can judge his actual policies during his administration, but I'm not going to blame Obama for that, because I think, let's be honest, the issue of gay marriage is one of those issues we really don't argue too much about anymore. I don't think for the most part that that's really even a big issue that we should be pinning on someone as being divisive. I think there was a strong movement toward that. And I've addressed that before myself personally. I think because the government is involved in marriage, which I don't think it should be. I think government should have never gotten involved in the marriage business in the first place, giving marriage licenses and things like that. But since it does, I think it was probably the right decision. And I think that's probably a pretty popular decision even on conservative sides today. Extreme end of things, maybe not.
Marriage is between a man and a woman.
Yeah. He utilized the IRS to target his political opponents. He weaponized the DOJ under both Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. He presided over the use of the...
That absolutely was not okay, and he should be dinged for that. And I think as time goes on and people are looking at his presidency less through the lens of their own biases and more objectively, I think that will probably be viewed pretty negatively.
Guy to target Donald Trump in the 2016 election. On the foreign policy front, he alienated traditional allies like Israel, sending pallets of cash to America's enemies like Iran. He basically ceded all of Crimea to Russia and then ceded leadership in Syria to Russia. He destabilized the Middle East by backing the Arab Spring, radically pulled American troops out of Iraq and led to the rise of ISIS. And by the way, he spent more money than all prior 43 presidents combined.
Let's see if my credit card
is that true?
So, yeah, terrible, terrible president.
Yeah, he's not in the bottom 10 at all. No way. Not a chance.
Worst presidents of all time. Most people label him the first, but I actually don't think he matches up, is James Buchanan. Saying that James Buchanan is the worst president of all time is a little much, considering that it would have been on him to stop the Civil War from happening. James Buchanan, in the lead up to the Civil War, endorsed the view that whatever the Supreme Court said about slavery would be obeyed.
I said this a little bit at the beginning already, and I'll reiterate it. The fact that I think James Buchanan was not an actively bad president. I just think he came to office at a time when anyone but an exceptional leader was going to fail. And he was not an exceptional leader. He had been Secretary of State and had done pretty well in that role. He's a very experienced guy. I just think he came, like Jimmy Carter, he came to office at a time when an exceptional leader was needed, and he wasn't that.
She knew the outcome of Dred Scott, which essentially ruled that black people were not citizens of the United States and could not be citizens of the United States beforehand when he said that. He was a Pennsylvania Democrat, very, very sympathetic to Southern slavery positions.
He was.
In his inaugural address, he called the issue of slavery, quote, happily a matter of but little practical importance.
That definitely you can hold against him. He basically blew it off as being an issue, and his whole presidency was one of not dealing with serious issues and just kind of saying, well, whatever.
Wrong. He actually said that while secession was illegal, the government didn't have the power to stop it, which led a lot of states to be like, okay, well, then I guess we can leave. Again, could he have prevented the Civil War from happening right then? Maybe. Although, obviously, the circumstances were building toward the Civil War pretty clearly. That's the only reason I don't have Buchanan.
I think when we get away from modern politics, so now we're looking at a presidency from, the 1800s, it seems like Ben is not showing a lot of his biases as much. And I think generally I agree with him. I think he's being pretty fair toward Buchanan here.
It's like number one on this list of crappy presidents.
Glory, glory, hallelujah, his marching on.
Second worst president of all time, Lyndon B. Johnson.
No.
Utter disaster.
Come on. Second worst president of all time? Woodrow Wilson better be number one, is all I'm saying, okay?
The only good mark on LBJ's record is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those are the only good marks. The big boo-boos for LBJ, the Great Society. So the Great Society was an attempt...
Okay, so I see where Shapiro's coming from. If you are of the mindset like Ben Shapiro that pretty much any big government program is bad, and I don't necessarily disagree. Like I'm a small government conservative, so I get that. But I think that's causing him to kind of go off the deep end, and anybody who instituted big government programs like Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, LBJ are going to be bad. But man, bottom two of all time? Nah. LBJ, again, probably goes in the middle for me somewhere.
To, quote, fight the war on poverty. This amounted to spending trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars.
Yeah, that was bad.
Making government encroach into nearly every area of American life, offering subsidies, threatening prosecutions and fines. Government offered, instead of prosperity, the prospect of intergenerational poverty through sponsorship of single motherhood, through welfare programs that disincentivized marriage. The blacks...
I'll give him this, that traditionally when the government throws a lot of money at something, it's not necessarily always that effective. I think the intentions were good. I don't know that the outcome was, but again, I don't think he's bottom two all time.
Single motherhood rate in 1960 was under 20%, and the black single motherhood rate today is about 70%.
That's true, but do we have any... This is an honest question. I don't know the answer to it. Do we have any evidence that there's a direct correlation between those two statistics and the policies of the Johnson administration? Like, can we really say that because that happened and this happened and in between something happened, that in between is the reason? I'm not sure.
The black middle class actually expanded way faster before the Great Society programs than they did after. According to the Cato Institute's Michael Tanner, between 1963 and 2010, the federal government spent $13 trillion fighting poverty. The poverty rate, by the way, in 2012 was 15%, slightly higher than it was in 1966. So he spent $13 trillion to increase the poverty rate. He got America deeply involved in the war in Vietnam, most disastrous war in American history. Even if you believe that we should have been involved in the war in Vietnam, if you're going to go in, you go in with overwhelming force, and you break things, and you win the war. That is not what LBJ did. He presided over serious racial unrest. Christopher Caldwell writes in his book...
And again, presided over in that he was president. How much of that is his fault, though?
The Age of Entitlement. The changes of the 1960s, with civil rights at their core, were not just a major new element in the Constitution. They were a rival constitution with which the old one was frequently incompatible. The federal government was given extraordinary power to end discrimination, both real and imagined, both in the private sector and in the public sector. As Caldwell writes, when instances of racism couldn't provide the proper pretext for government interventionism, the rubric of anti-discrimination was expanded to include any supposedly victimized minority group. So this paves the way for the LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign movement. The civil rights models of executive order, litigation, court-ordered redress eventually became the basis for government to do what the Constitution would previously not have permitted.
In 1913, Woodrow Wilson takes us into World War I.
The worst president in American history, bar none, Woodrow Wilson.
All right, Ben. You have redeemed yourself. Here's the thing. I've said this before. If we're having a conversation about worst president, I'll include Wilson. Do I think Woodrow Wilson was the worst president of all time? No. Is he in the conversation? Yes.
First of all, he was an authoritarian. He actually wrote, quote, "The president is at liberty, both in law and conscience, to be as big a man as he can. His capacity will set the limit." He actually believed that the presidency of the United States was really the only branch that ought to matter. The idea is that experts in the executive would be able to do things and react more quickly than the antiquated checks and balances of the Constitution.
He's not the first president to think that way, and he's certainly not the last, but yeah.
Moral level, Wilson was just craptastic. He was a fan of eugenics. He actually pushed for compulsory sterilization of people with Down syndrome in 1907, before he was president. He even signed a compulsory sterilization bill while he was governor of New Jersey in 1911. Famously, he promised to keep America out of the war.
I mean, that's some straight out of the Nazi playbook type stuff there. Sterilizing, compulsory sterilization for people with Down syndrome. Yeah, and then he runs on an anti-war policy in 1916 and then immediately gets us involved in the war as soon as he is sworn back into office.
His re-elect effort in 1916 then got America involved in World War I by helping to blockade Germany. And then when Germany attacked American shipping, got America directly involved in World War I.
I don't know that we helped blockade Germany. I mean, we were certainly running their sub-blockade against warnings from Germany.
His attempts to broker a peace at the Versailles Conference ended in utter disaster.
So here's what I'll say about the Versailles. Sometime we'll have to do a whole video on this, on Woodrow Wilson at Versailles. A lot of people will say, well, his 14 points, if we would have adopted those, then we don't deal with World War II. And to an extent, that's probably true. But the problem with Woodrow Wilson is that no matter how good his ideas might have been, he was still Woodrow Wilson, and he had this messiah complex, and he had this attitude that ran throughout his presidency and throughout his life, that everyone else is an idiot, and he's the only one who knows what he's talking about. And if you disagree with him, that just shows what a moron you are. And so there was very little room in Woodrow Wilson's life for people who didn't accept everything he said and everything he did as the best. And he carried that attitude into Versailles. And so no matter how good his ideas might have been, his inflexibility and his unwillingness to go along with things he might disagree with otherwise, and his unwillingness to accept people disagreeing with him, tanked anything he might have done, and it ended up causing more harm than good.
Probably paved the way for World War II.
But I'm not going to put that on him.
His Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, and he helped press forward the Sedition Act of 1918 that actually made it a crime for American citizens to, quote, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government. Wild.
Now, he's not the first person to do that. John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were very similar. Abraham Lincoln dealt with some of those kinds of issues, but Lincoln was also dealing with an internal rebellion at the time. What Wilson was doing was not unlike what a lot of other democratic countries were doing at this time. Doesn't make it okay. He also, of course, brings in the Federal Reserve and the first permanent income tax.
Unconstitutional. He nationalized major American industries, including the telegraph industry, the telephone industry, railroads industry.
Yeah.
He created a massive economic recession that actually developed into an outright economic crisis in 1920. On the racial front, disaster area.
Yeah.
He resegregated the federal
100%.
services. He presided over major race riots. He showed Birth of a Nation at the White House and called it writing history with lightning. And by the last couple of years of his administration, he was not even in charge of his own administration. His brain was actually non-functional, and it was eaten.
I wouldn't go so far as to say his brain was non-functional. He had a stroke, and he was certainly, to some degree, incapacitated. And yes, his wife was definitely acting as president. And you can read all about all the details of that. Not sure how much I blame him personally for that, especially if he was incapacitated.
Edith Wilson, who was actually governing the country at that point. So a terrible president, economically terrible president, terrible wartime president, terrible president on race, terrible president in terms of structuring a massive federal bureaucracy. Just a horrific president, Woodrow Wilson. If somebody says George W. Bush was the worst president ever, really? Did George W. Bush show Birth of a Nation at the White House and stand for eugenics and get us into World War I leading to World War II and also declare himself kind of a dictator? Did he do those things? No. His two big failings, the Iraq War and the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, that crisis was not of his making. That came from the Clinton administration. It was their attempt to push subprime mortgages down on the bank.
I do agree, like I said at the beginning, that sometimes what a president has as far as a crisis that people blame on him was inherited, but you also have to take responsibility for how you respond to it. You can make it worse, you can make it better. And so can we pin the economic recession completely on Bush? No. But it's fair to judge how he responded to it.
Banks and allow bad borrowers to take the money. As far as the Iraq War had wide bipartisan support. And then there's Trump. When people say that Trump was the worst president ever, what they're really referring to is his rhetoric, the bad tweets, whatever kind of weird stuff he was saying that day. But in terms of policy, not even close. Trump presided over a massively booming economy. He put conservatives on the Supreme Court to actually reestablish the checks and balances set up by the Constitution. He helped actually broker peace in the Middle East, which used to be a Nobel Prize thing. And now everybody just...
Yeah, but if we're going to give Trump credit for that, then we also have to give credit to Jimmy Carter for that, right? I mean, the Camp David Accords.
Ignores because Trump did it. He kept Russia and China.
Everybody who claims they brought peace to the Middle East, it was temporary at best, right?
Largely in check. He's the first president in my lifetime who didn't get America involved directly in a foreign war. The notion that Trump is even remotely near the top of the list of worst presidents ignores a lot of very, very bad presidents.
I think, honestly, when it comes to Trump, it's just way too early to say. And yes, a lot of people are going to say, well, what about January 6th? Well, honestly, even with that, it's way too early to be judging that. And I think anybody who says anything about Bush, Obama, Biden, or Trump being the worst of all time is blinded by their bias. And it is way too early to say that. Come back in 20 years and we can start to maybe a little bit more fairly judge those things. Honestly, I think it's just stupid to even try and rank presidents from the last 20, 30 years. It's going to change so much, so much as time goes on. So let me know your thoughts. Keep it civil. Disagree strongly, but do it without being disagreeable. Keep it to the facts. Keep it to issues and not to personal stuff. So let me know your thoughts. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.